plants that we're going to talk about today are ones that I really love and um, use so much in my gardens, both in Connecticut and now here in Maine. And my plan is today is to talk a little bit just the basics of how I approach shade and shade gardening and developing a woodland garden. And then most of the talk is just going to be looking at neat plants for shade garden. Some you're going to know, and hopefully a few are going to be new to you. And you'll learn a few new things that you're just going to have to buy and put in your gardens. So let me share my screen here and let's see. Let's see here. Everybody see that okay? It's coming through? Okay, perfect. All right. Okay, so when you talk about, you hear the word shade, there's always so many different things, and when you read in catalogs and books, and so many terms for shade. There's everything from full shade, then there's dense shade, and it's like, okay, is there a difference there? And light shade, dappled light, bright light, everything. It's just very, very confusing, and many of these terms really mean the same thing in my mind, and it just depends on your interpretation of the terms and what you consider to be full shade, part shade, dappled light, that type of thing. And for our intents and purposes, I'm just kind of limiting to three different types of shade that I've had experience gardening with in the past. And most of the plants we're going to look at today are going to fall into the kind of dappled shade category. That's the gardening that I've done and the amount of shade that I've had most experience with, and one that I found most of the plants do really well, with that amount of light. And when we talk about dappled shade, it's typically it's the light that you get with this type of shading. It's always moving. The light is always in flux, and the sunlight is filtering through the canopy up above, and it's not always in one place. It depends if there's a breeze that keeps changing the shade around. So there's at no one time is the same amount of light always hitting a particular leaf or flower or plant. There may be an hour or two of direct sunlight, but for the most part, you're talking about a lot of bright indirect light coming through the upper canopy. And in my opinion, it's probably the most ideal form of shade to grow the widest diversity of plants. And here are just a few examples of what I would consider kind of dappled shade. You see how the sun is coming through in various amounts and hitting these plants underneath. Again, you see brighter on one side and then darker towards the back of this schizophragma vine. And then we get into partial shade. And here, this is more, I look at partial shade and as areas where you might get a half a day of direct sun and then shade the rest of the day, or maybe part of the canopy is opened up because of blowdowns, that type of thing. So you're getting several hours of sun, and then the rest of the day is more shaded. With these types of areas, I typically prefer the woodland plants that they get morning sun rather than the afternoon, because it's that intense sun that we get from like noon until 3 or 4 o'clock in the afternoon that really our shade loving plants just will not do well. They'll burn, they'll scorch on the edges, as opposed to morning sun, which the temperatures are cooler, the sun's not as intense, the angle of the sun is lower, and the plants will tolerate, having those, 5 to 6 hours of sunlight and not end up getting injured by intense sun rays. You can grow a wide range of plants in this particular setting. I mean, one thing with this is I would say you do, in general, you can grow more flowering plants. I've found, because thing to keep in mind with any shade gardening, the more dense the shade, typically less flowering. That for plants to really produce a large number of flowers, you really need to provide them with a good amount of sun to get the potential flowering that you expect. If you take a rhododendron and you put it in the darkest shade, more than likely you're just going to get a lot of foliage growth and very few flowers. They just don't produce that many flowers. And also the shading will affect the coloration of the flowers. They tend to be more faded out with too much shade. So keep that in mind too as you are designing your shade gardens. Here you see a particular garden that gets morning sun. And you can see there's a whole range of plants that are enjoying this. You've got epimediums and ferns and some hostas that are doing quite well. They're actually growing very happily. There's some brunera in there. And they're loving this morning sun, and then the afternoon shade is ideal. It's not dark shade. It's, these trees you can see have been limbed up, so there's still a lot of bright indirect light in the afternoon, so they're still getting plenty of light that they need, but they are receiving direct sun in the morning time. And here again, you see morning light on a hosta garden, and they're thriving in this particular setting. Again, the trees are limbed up, has a wonderful backdrop of forest behind it, so the hostas really stand out, but you see that they're getting some consistent hours of direct sun, and then eventually they'll be in complete shade. Dense shade or deep shade is probably the hardest type of shade to find plants that are really going to do well there. It's just a difficult setting to grow and to garden in my opinion. I mean, there are some things, and for this, when I've had to suggest plants for people when I was working at the nursery, basically I would just kind of think about what I used or what I would see in my hikes around the woods and what plants were doing well in deep shade situations. And so you're going to see a lot of things like ferns, that will thrive. And for the most part, you really don't see a lot of things flowering heavily in this darker shade. You're really getting limited as far as your plant choices and what you can put in there. But I'll touch on one or two things later on in the lecture that I found actually do flower and grow quite well in some of these darker areas of the garden. And when we're designing our shade or woodland gardens, a few things that I've tried to do and I've been looking at my shade garden is I really tend to focus on foliage and the form of the plant and the habit of the plant, and mix them together to really create these really beautiful, different textures, and combine big leaves with small leaves, fine grasses, haconocloas with, hostas, and just get, a really diverse palette of forms to add as much interest as possible in a shade garden. And as with, any garden, shade or sun, you want to tend to repeat colors if possible and textures. So you have a really continuous garden, and unified garden is always helpful, as opposed to just kind of onesie twosies everywhere. It's more, select plants and combinations that are more work together really well and complement each other is always something to keep in mind when you're making plant selections for any garden, not just a shade garden. And I tend to, I don't like straight lines in my gardens. I mean, they are appropriate for some different types of garden beds, but for a shade garden, I tend to like more curving and flowing lines to the beds. I think it looks more natural in my opinion. And as I mentioned earlier, for the deep shade, I try to take a lot of clues from the surrounding habitats that I have around wherever I'm living, or from my hikes in the woods, and just observe and see, get ideas, of textures and colors and plants that grow in different light situations. I think it will help you out a lot when you go to make your choices, at a garden center or nursery, when you're picking out plants, kind of say, hey, I remember seeing that growing really well with with our native birch trees or native witch hazels. You see different types of sedges that grow well with our native, Hamamelis virginiana, the native witch hazels and things like that. It's just clues from nature help a lot when it goes to designing a garden. Just different habitats and light levels, just taking all observations that we can and putting those into use in our gardening. Looking at different combinations here, we've got a native oxalis growing with their native bunchberry, Cornus canadensis. Different textures, nice combinations of foliage. And here again, we've got different textures, bigger leaves mixed in with smaller dissected foliage here. That's Mucdenia on the left, that more lobed leaf that you see here with my cursor. And then this is an epimedium relative that you see on the right-hand side here that loves shade too. And I tend to, with my shade gardening, I tend to do more of an informal look, same with the edging, rather than the straight lines. I think the rounded lines look more informal. And I don't try to do like, okay, if I do this on one side of the path, I want to do the exact same thing on the other. I try to do more asymmetrical designs, the way I look at shade gardening. And I just think the informal look more mimics what you see in nature. And I try to, with the shade gardening, is with my more formal shade gardening, I try to create it so that it then blends into its surrounding native woods around it. So you don't see a distinct, here's the garden, here's the woods. It's more garden, and then it just kind of flows right into the natural woodland. Here you see a nice wooded slope in the springtime with all the ephemerals. You see trilliums and mertensias and uvularias and polygonatums and leucothoe here down in the bottom right, looking really beautiful, nice evergreen shrub. Just beautiful combinations of foliage and flowers and habits. And sometimes when you're gardening, you have a woodland and you need to make some changes to it. So the key thing first is to add more plant diversity to your woodland. And and then the other thing is look at ways to, if it's really dark, to increase the lighting. And that's going to involve things like limbing up some of the trees to get more of a higher canopy, possibly even taking some trees out to let in some more light periodically, depending on the angle of the sun, to make it brighter, so you can add more diversity to your woodland and create more of an exciting shade garden. And then I also try to add in some other like hardscape features, like bring in some stones from nearby, or maybe a stump that looks really neat, has some cool features to it, or logs and things, just to bring in that more natural look. And again, so there's more of that flow from your garden into the surrounding woodland. And if you have the abilities and the capability to bring in some water, and it can be even just the smallest little pond, or even a container of some sort of decorative form that you can have moss growing around and plants kind of cascading over, adding the element of water, and possibly, moving water, dripping water, you add the element of sound to the shade garden, I think is just just another sense that we can add, and it's often forgot, the sense of sound in the garden. You know, we get the rustling of trees and all, but you know, hearing water trickling is just a wonderful experience. And I find even more so when you're in a shade garden. It just reminds me of a stream or a river um, in a beautiful shaded setting. And here again, just a couple of examples of some nice kind of that dappled high canopy shade situation where you can see just a really diverse selection of plants, you know, growing wonderfully in this situation. And we'll talk as we get into the plants. A lot of these plants prefer kind of, you're going to hear it a lot, that moist, rich humus, well-drained soils. And you know, if you have these kind of sloping areas in shade, these are really perfect growing conditions for many of our woodland plants. They prefer soils that stay moist but not soggy. And this, you know, with a slope, the water is going to drain down slope, so the roots will get moisture but not be standing in really overly saturated soils. And I can't stress the importance of foliage in any garden, but particularly in a woodland garden. And these are just some examples of things I try to do in the gardens here at coastal Maine, but also in my personal gardens. It's just adding really cool combinations of textures and colors to the woodland garden. You know, here you see hostas and ferns and polygonatums and, you know, blues and greens and variegation. And then, you know, regersea on the left, within the Japanese painted fern on the right-hand side. Just beautiful combinations of foliage. You know, because our flowers, for the most part, for many plants, you know, flowers only last a few weeks. And then, you know, we're relying on the foliage to really provide interest in the garden for a good part of our growing season. So, you know, that is just a really important aspect to keep in mind when we're picking plants. I always tend to fall into, I say this all the time and I preach this, but I always, you know, when I'm in the garden center, I see something in flower, you know, it's that impulse and you got to get it. And, you know, I've been trying to be really good. And while I'm picking out things that I do love the flowers of, also considering the foliage after the flowers have faded. And here you see the big astaboides on the right. And, you know, these leaves are maybe 1.5 feet across, if not bigger, with a bright yellow dicentra, bleeding heart. So now let's get into the plants. This is the favorite part, and I'm going to move through these relatively quickly because I've got quite a few in here, and it's always hard for me to pare down my slides that I want to show everybody because there are just so many plants that I want to share with you. But let's get started. We'll start right now with a plant that's blooming beautifully now, probably in your area and up here, I know in Maine, they're in full flower right now. And this is our native bloodroot, Sanguinaria canadensis. It's a spring ephemeral, so it's going to appear now and then eventually go dormant in the summertime. It's, you know, 6 to 7 inches tall, has these wonderful single white flowers. As you see here, they're coming up like this with the leaf kind of curled around it. And it's thought that those leaves help protect the stems. So if we get, you know, heavy wind and rain this time of year, protects those stems from breaking. And they will close up in the evening and then open when the sun comes out the next day, and just basically lay flat into these perfect, lovely single white flowers. And then once the flowers have faded, you have this really interesting lobe foliage that comes out and then will last for several months until they do eventually go dormant, and called bloodroot because if you happen to be digging them up and you break a stem, you'll see that really rich kind of orangey red coloration to the sap that oozes out, thus the name bloodroot. And sanguinaria, sanguine refers to that blood coloration in the stems. Just a wonderful little plant, and it will seed in around the garden once you have it. And that's due to ants. Ants love a little fleshy structure that's on the seeds. So they'll grab those seeds and eat the fleshy part and then leave the seed elsewhere. So if you end up finding bloodroot scattered throughout the gardens, you can thank the ants for that. They are helping you spread bloodroot throughout the garden. And it's a great little plant. It's not one that I mind having appear here and there in the garden. Another really nice early flowering, a native ephemeral is anemonella, the rue anemones. And this is a tough little plant. It looks very delicate and looks like it would be very brittle, but it's one that has these thin, wiry stems that come up about 10 to 12 inches tall. And they're topped with these, again, wonderful white little flowers. They're about 1.5 inches across, maybe 1 inch across, usually 3 at the top of a stem. The foliage resembles a taller perennial called Thalictrum, or the meadow ruse, and that's hence the Latin name Thalictroides refers to the resemblance of the foliage to Thalictrums. And this will take a little bit of sun. So this is one that I would put in the garden where it would get morning sun and then afternoon shade. It would love that kind of a situation. And you'll see this growing in the wild in our area here, in woodland edges, along streams with that kind of high canopy shade area. It does, like many of these, as I mentioned, that kind of moist, well-drained soils are ideal for this plant. There's a really beautiful double form called Cameo. And what I love about these double forms of our native rue anemone is they flower for such a long period of time. This will be in flower for at least a month, if not a month and a half. And it just produces these, they're almost, I would say, nearly perfect double flowers. They're just exquisite. And if you have the chance and you find this at a nursery or online, I would strongly recommend you try this plant. It looks very delicate and, like maybe going to be finicky to grow, but it's actually a very easy plant to grow. And as I said, you'll be treated with these beautiful flowers, and it has that, that kind of wonderful Thalictrum-like foliage later on, but then will eventually tend to fade out in the summertime and go dormant. Just a beautiful, beautiful flowering native woodland plant. Our native Dutchman's breeches. This is flowering right now up here at the gardens. You see the resemblance of the flowers to the old-fashioned pantaloons, which I love this plant. It's a dicentra, so it's related to our bleeding hearts that most of us know, both the taller, big pink heart-shaped ones, but then also the fern leaf types of bleeding hearts. Has this wonderful lacy blue-green foliage that you'll see. And this again is spread around thanks to our friends, the ants. They like the structures on the seeds and will spread it around. Typically, the flower color is this nice bright white that comes up on these arching stems. Often, or occasionally, you will see some forms that have a lovely pale pink cast to the flowers as well. And that's a lovely contrast with the blue-green foliage. And this will spread slowly by these really fleshy underground rhizomes, and you'll get kind of a really wonderful mass planting of these plants. You'll see here, this is a newer clump that's just starting to grow. You can see how lacy that foliage is and kind of the habitat that it prefers. You see it's growing in an oak woodland here. So it likes, again, that kind of soils that's rich in nutrients and composting leaves and rich in humus is ideal for these plants. They will detest if the soils get very dry and droughty. They will quickly get crispy and burn on the edges and not be happy. So a consistently moist soil is ideal. Bruneras. There have been a lot of Bruneras, or I don't like the common name, bug loss. That's just not a very attractive common name, so I call them Bruneras. Many have been introduced in the market of late with various amounts of silver coloration to the foliage. They have these wonderful forget-me-not-like flowers on them that you see here. Here's a close-up, just really beautiful, I think, delicate blue flower. This, and I love the color blue on flowers, and this kind of porcelain blue that you see here is just wonderful to add in the shade garden. There are the species Macrophylla has just these pure green leaves that you see here. But what people will commonly use, and I would recommend, are some of these really dramatic silver foliage forms. The most common one that's available right now is Jack Frost. It's a really reliable plant. They have these big heart-shaped leaves that have a kind of almost a rough sandpapery-like texture to them if you rub your fingers on them, but just this beautiful bright silver overlay on the foliage with darker venation. And it's a great plant to use if you do have a little bit of darker shade. By putting in these bright silver leaves, it really lights up a shade garden and gives you that pop of color, and brightens up a darker spot in the garden. Here you see a close-up, just a wonderful. I will sometimes go and cut these leaves and bring them in and use them in inside decorations, and and informal decorations in vases and things like that, and bring them inside. They're just wonderful, and they'll last for a few days in a vase of water. There's a form called variegata, which has very dramatic yellow, creamy yellow edges to the foliage. This one does require shade for sure, and no afternoon sun. If it gets that intense sun, you will see these creamy edges will get crispy brown and burn up. It's very sensitive to a lot of bright, intense sunlight. So it needs to be placed strategically in areas where it will only get some direct sunlight in the morning time, and then pretty much full high canopy shade in the afternoon to protect the foliage. But again, similar flower color, just wonderful. That blue contrasting with the variegation, I think is perfect. This is a super tough little native plant. This is our native wild ginger, and it's a deciduous ginger. So we have some evergreen forms. Many Asian forms are evergreen and have beautiful silvery foliage to them, with different amounts of silver and variegation to them. This is our native one. It has very soft, velvety, heart-shaped foliage, and it will form a really wonderful deciduous ground cover. So this time of year, the foliage is coming up, and it will spread and form over 4 or 5 years. I would say a patch that could be 6 feet by 6 feet over time. And it just creeps among the rocks and through the oak leaves. And you see it has these really wonderful, unique maroon flowers to them that are formed underneath the leaves. So really appreciate them. You have to get down on your hands and knees to look at the flowers, but it's just a perfect plant if you're looking for something to kind of fill in amongst some of your taller perennials. This is a great one to just kind of let it creep around. It's not, I wouldn't say very thuggish, but one thing I did find though is it will tolerate a fair amount of drought. I had this growing in Connecticut underneath some giant Norway spruce trees, and it won't maybe spread as quickly because of the the drier soils, but it does spread, and it just gave a green coloration, a green carpet to the shade garden at my house in Connecticut. And here you see the foliage just coming out and those unique flowers starting to develop, and how fuzzy the foliage and the stems are on the leaves. And as I mentioned, there are some forms that tend to be more evergreen. This is the European one with these really dark, lustrous, dark green foliage. And you can see how this also spreads and is forming this wonderful evergreen ground cover with just this beautiful foliage mixed in here with some deciduous azaleas. Just a perfect plant. I love this. Again, the flowers though are underneath all of this foliage. But for me, you're not growing this plant for the flowers, you're growing it for that beautiful lustrous foliage. And just a close-up of that foliage and how shiny it is. We have a couple of different types of native baneberries, the Actaeas or Simicifugas. Now they're starting to be put in that genus rather than Actaea. These are the baneberries, and there's white and red. And my favorite is the white baneberry, sometimes referred to as doll's eyes, because the fruit are thought to remember old-fashioned eyes that were used on dolls back in the day. And this plant you grow for the fruit display later in the summer. And this is what you're greeted with. It's just a very dramatic cluster of fruits with those bright white fruits that are attached to the bright red structure holding them. Just a beautiful cluster of fruits that can be up to six inches long. And very showy in a shaded situation. The plant itself grows up to 3 feet tall, maybe 24 to 36 inches tall. has a compound leaf, so it's dissected into leaflets. The flowers are, you see clusters, terminal clusters of these many little tiny white star-shaped flowers that you see here, and you see the foliage, how it's dissected into these many leaflets here. So again, a great textural element. And then it's just the fruit that is so appealing. The red is also very showy. You know, it's super glossy, dark red, fire engine red fruits. But the clusters are much smaller than you find with the white baneberry. But again, equally as showy, just something to add more interest later in the season after the flowers have gone by. So you have nice foliage as well as beautiful fruits on the baneberries. Our trilliums, you know, there are so many trilliums, our native trilliums and many Asian forms. You know, this is our common Trillium erectum that you see, that you'll find throughout the woods in our area. Just a beautiful ephemeral plant with that three-parted leaf and the wonderful maroon flowers. You know, it's just a delight when you're taking a hike in the woods and you see the trilliums. That you know that spring has really arrived in earnest. Here, just a close-up of the flower. You know, called stinking Benjamin because the flowers have kind of a unpleasant odor, and that is intended to attract their pollinators, which tend to be different types of flies that kind of are attracted to that foul odor, but also some of our early flying native bees too, which is important. Trillium grandiflorum is an even showier species of trillium that's actually very easy to grow. These beautiful big white flowers that stand just above the foliage, and here you see a substantial patch of these plants growing. This was actually, I believe, at Garden in the Woods or Native Plant Trust now down in Massachusetts, where they have just an impressive trillium collection. If you get a chance, I would highly recommend going down there. But just beautiful plant for the woodland. It's, you know, when you hear shade gardening, trilliums are almost always included in a shade garden. And it's because of these early spring flowering, beautiful flowers that come out and just delight us in the springtime. And there's this wonderful double form that is highly sought after, very expensive for the most part. You know, these tend to be at least, you know, $50 to $60 a piece for, you know, a single stem of the double form, but well worth it, well worth the money. It's a beautiful, perfect double flower. It really adds so much to the shade garden, really stands out in a darker spot. You can see here on the right-hand side with a very shaded situation. I mean, the camera made it look darker than it is, but you see how that bright white flower just shines in the shade garden. And then just a few other ones just to showcase the diversity that we can add to the shade garden. The painted trillium is another wonderful native trillium. You know, and these all like that moist, you know, humus, well-drained soils, and typically they're growing anywhere from 12 to 18 inches tall. And then there's some sessile forms of trillium. Sessile being that the flowers are not on stalks, but they're right on top of the foliage. So sessile to the foliage. And these also, what I love about these is their foliage is also very attractive. They have all typically different amounts of silver splashing on the foliage. So you have these kind of very interesting, they can be either greenish yellow or that maroon coloration as well. But then the foliage is very, you know, just ornate. You know, it really stands out once the flowers have gone by. You have this kind of interesting silvery splash foliage, and these clumps will slowly increase in size. We're probably looking at, this could be a 6 to 7 year old clump, so it's not particularly fast. And thus, a lot of times when you see the expense of trilliums, because they're not quick to propagate. And just a close-up of that foliage and the flowers. Epimediums are my favorites. They'll be coming into flower about now. Their flowers buds are coming up and they're starting to open. And there are many different types of epimediums. Nivium is one of the more popular ones. And there are some trailing forms, there are clump forms of epimediums. And epimediums, another benefit of them, they're quite drought tolerant once they get established. Deer tend to leave them alone, which is a big plus in our area. And just come in all assortment of flower colors, as you'll see here. I'm just going to run through a few of these, from white in the niviums. Domino is a very popular one with these big spurred flowers that are kind of bicolor with pink and white, and then have these lustrous dark green leaves. There's some orange flowering ones. This is Orange Queen. And this is one that actually will form a ground cover over time, and it will slowly spread. Same with this one, Paralchicum Whistly. And this is wonderful. This is almost evergreen. Was for me in Connecticut. And this is a spreading form, and you get this lustrous dark green foliage later on in the summer. And you see the flowers come just above the foliage, these bright yellow flowers that stand out against the foliage. And then this is a picture I took of the foliage in late November, early December in Connecticut. And you see how wonderful that evergreen ground cover could be in a shade garden. It's just perfect. And these were growing under a lot of established white pine trees that had been limbed up quite high. So there was a lot of bright light. So I got lots of flowers, and the foliage remained perfect, and they got some protection from the evergreens above them, which was great. And these are just perfect plants. This is one genus that I collect, and I have a huge collection of epimediums just because I love the diversity that you can get from the flowers as well as the foliage and the habits of the plants. And here you see some of the unique colorations you can get in the emerging foliage, from this dark kind of maroon chocolatey color to this really neat venation pattern you see on the left-hand side. Pink champagne, I think right now on the market, is one of the more popular ones. It's a strong growing form, a clump form. It comes out with these beautiful mottled leaves, and then these wonderful pink flowers. It's just epimediums, I can't say enough about them. I would strongly encourage you to plant epimediums in your shade garden for sure. The jack-in-the-pulpits, here's another group that, this tends to be more of a collector's plant. This is our native jack-in-the-pulpit, Erycema triphyllum. But they just have such neat, cool flowers to look at. And here, just pointing out, if you're into such things, just what they call the different parts of the inflorescence of the flower of the jack-in-the-pulpit. You have the spadix in the center there, surrounded by that hood or the spathe that can be, different colors streaked with greens and maroons. And just a wonderful shade native perennial. But there are many, many forms of Erycemas from throughout the world that we can grow right here in New Hampshire and Maine. These are the seeds that you'll find, very attractive later on in the summer. Bright red seed heads. And here, just to show you a few of the interesting forms, this is Erycema ringens that you see here. This is the cobra lily and the pink flowering candissimum. And then one of my favorites, the Japanese jack-in-the-pulpit Sakokianum, just beautiful. Look at that white, it's just wonderful plants. And I grow a few of these even just in containers and grow them that way. And it's just a big kind of a tuber that you can grow. And the important thing is once they go dormant is just to let them dry out, let that container dry out so they don't rot once the foliage goes dormant, and they'll be fine. They really want well-drained soils as well. The Japanese wood poppy, Glaucidium palmatum, a beautiful form here. I don't know if any of you have grown this, but it's that's called a woodland poppy because the flowers resemble a poppy flower. This is a clump forming plant. It has these kind of big, almost big maple-like leaves. Typically the flower color is this kind of lavender pink that you see here. It grows 18 to 20 inches tall. There is a beautiful pure white form as well. But it's a perfect plant if you can find it. A lot of times you'll find this one in specialty nurseries, shade nurseries, but also online sources. You can find this one frequently as well. And that's Glaucidium palmatum, palmatum referring to the palmate type of foliage. And here you see it just emerging. You can see that kind of dissected maple-like foliage and just those beautiful flowers that are about 2.5 to 3 inches across. Mertensia, this is native more to the southeastern part of the United States, but if you really want that splash of blue and a fair amount of it, I would suggest trying Mertensia. It will seed in and spread in the garden. It forms a pretty substantial patch of over time in the garden. Has these wonderful blue bell-like flowers you see here, kind of little trumpets that hang down from pink buds. It's ephemeral, so it will go dormant later in the summer. So it's important to mark where any spring ephemeral is, just so you don't accidentally dig it up if you're planting something because you forget where these are. It's easily done, and it's important to try to mark them with either the name tag or some sort of a device so you don't accidentally injure these plants when they do go dormant. But it's a beautiful plant. It's easy to grow, not very demanding. The flowers come up about 20 inches tall above the foliage. It has this nice kind of a blue-green foliage that emerges with a little bit of a maroon cast to the foliage. I really love them. I've had a patch several years. I would say probably for 15 years I had one, and it had expanded to maybe 5 feet by 8 feet over time, but easily contained too. So it's something, if you don't want it to get that big, you can easily just get in with a shovel and pull it out. It's easy to remove. The plant named after our third president, Thomas Jefferson, Jeffersonia diphylla, the twin leaf. Here you can see called twin leaf because of the way the leaves are dissected into two halves, almost resemble kind of angel wings. I would resemble that, what it reminds me of. These are emerging and starting to flower right now. A beautiful foliage plant, and then these pristine white flowers that come up just above the foliage, so they're not necessarily hidden, which is nice. And I like it because of the unique foliage. It's a clump forming plant that will grow 15 inches tall or so. And it will seed in. Again, this is another one of those ant plants. So the ants love the seeds and will spread it some throughout the garden. You see here on the left-hand side, this is what holds the seeds. And you see on the top of this, just below this little point, you see this line here. When the seeds are ripe and mature, that cracks open right at that line. And so that little cap kind of pops open, and then the ripe seeds will, as this seed capsule is tossed around by wind or if something brushes up against it, those seeds then are knocked to the ground, and that's the way the seeds are dispersed. It's kind of an interesting seed dispersal system. And here just a close-up and how beautiful that really shines in the shade garden. And there's a Japanese kind of cousin for our native Jeffersonia diphylla. This is Jeffersonia dubia. And basically the main difference here is the foliage isn't dissected as severely as you saw with the native one. And the flower color is a kind of a lavender blue color that you see here. Here's a close-up of it. Beautiful spring ephemeral plant. This is a Japanese plant, Saruma henryi. It's called upright wild ginger because it really resembles that wild ginger we saw a few slides ago, the Sarum canadense, because the foliage has that nice fuzzy heart-shaped look to it, but the flowers are different. These, you don't have to get down on your hands and knees to appreciate. They're up higher. This plant will grow 12 to 15 inches tall and produce these three-petaled yellow flowers. And this will slowly spread by rhizomes, not invasively or aggressively at all. But a wonderful addition to the shade garden. It's something a little bit different. Here you see a patch that's probably 6 or 7 years old. It may be 3 by 3. You can see though how the flowers are produced up above. But just again, something different to add to the garden, to add more diversity to the shade garden. it will go, it's deciduous. So in the fall, you'll need to be in there and just cut it back with a pair of shears or clippers or something. But it just provides this wonderful heart-shaped fuzzy foliage. And then um, yellow flowers, I would say they'll start in another couple of weeks, and then it will flower sporadically well into the summer with flowers on and off. So you'll have some flowering, I would say, through the month of June. And then there's the uvularias and the polygonatums and their relatives that are also wonderful plants to include in the garden. You see here, this is the native Uvularia grandiflora with these big, kind of drooping, pendulous yellow flowers with the strap-like petals that you see here. It's a slow expanding clump form to this, 18 to 20 inches tall, these kind of fleshy stems. But I love this plant. It's very easy to grow. It's easy to propagate from seed. If you want to grow more of it and share some with your friends or plant sales, it's a perfect one to do that. It really prefers the kind of high canopy dappled light type of shade. And I mentioned it's relative to polygonatums. There are many, many forms of polygonatums. One of the more popular ones is the odoratum variegatum that has that kind of subtle creamy edge to the foliage. And this does spread, as you see, by these underground rhizomes and will form a substantial patch. So it's a kind of a tall, deciduous ground cover, if you will, that will grow, up to 2 feet tall with these slightly arching stems. They have these lovely, slightly fragrant white bells that hang from the leaf axils. And there are a few other forms that I've come to love and would recommend. This one's a little more showier than the variegatum. This is called double wide, so that creamy margin is much more pronounced and distinctive and much more showier in the shade garden. But otherwise, it's very similar to the variegated one, the variegatum. And here you see a patch of that double wide. And again, here mixed in with hostas. And this is Iris cristata, our native creeping iris. And, a rhododendron behind it there. And just a few other forms of polygonatums that you can find. This is red legs, which has reddish stems, and then a species called kingianum, which has these unique orange flowers and very narrow, lacy foliage that could grow 3 to 4 feet tall. So it's just things to consider. And, when you're looking at a nursery and catalogs, just keep, as much as possible, just keep adding to the diversity of plants, because it just adds so much more interest to the garden. And then another close relative to the uvularias and polygonatums are the smilocenas, as they were once called, but then they've changed the genus now to Dimayanthemums. And these are the false Solomon seals with their terminal clusters of tiny little white flowers that you see here on these wonderful arching stems. And then later on, the fruits, they start out a kind of a beige color, and then they quickly ripen to a bright red color. I don't have a picture of that part, but they're just this brilliant, bright red. So you've got these wonderful flowers, and then followed by the bright red fruits. Most people think too that the peonies are reserved more for the sunnier areas, and there are actually some woodland peonies that you should, if you haven't, I would highly encourage you to try to find and plant in your shade gardens, because there are these beautiful woodland peonies that actually require shaded situations to do well. And this is one that's more probably easier to find in the trade. And this is just the Paeonia japonica, the Japanese peony, with these really gorgeous bowl-shaped white flowers with just the bright yellow stamens in the center. It's just a perfect plant for the shade garden. And it's once you have it, and you get a substantial established clump of 7 or 8 stems each with several flowers that you see here. It's just gorgeous peony. And for the shade, which I never really realized. I always thought of peonies out in the sun and sunny borders. But there are several forms now that we can find to plant in our shade gardens. And here's one that's just starting to go by a little bit. You see this one has a little bit of a brush strokes of kind of lovely violet color in the center. And then the shredded umbrella plant. This is Sinalesis aconidifolia. This is a perfect plant, if you're not familiar with it, to try. It will slowly form a colony of stems, but it's such a unique plant. This is the foliage that's emerging out of the ground. It's very, very hairy and fuzzy, and it's really a unique look, and it just keeps popping up. And as the foliage expands, you see here it's starting to expand more. You can still see all the hairs on the foliage, and then they open up, and they have this very deeply dissected type of foliage to them, and it's very, very unique. So that's where the shredded umbrella part comes in as far as the common name. So it forms these umbrellas, but it's like an umbrella that's been ripped apart by the wind, and it's just a really cool leaf to include in the garden. I love this plant. The flowers are really nondescript. They come up on these long stalks above the foliage, and they're kind of like a creamy green color that really, it's not grown for flowers. A lot of times I'll just cut the flower stalks off just so it doesn't produce seed, and all the energy just goes into the plant itself rather than seed formation. This is one that you really just want to grow for the cool foliage, and seeing that when you have a planting of this and it's forming, the rhizomes are spreading, and you see all of those fuzzy things emerging out of the ground, it's a really fun thing to have in the garden. And there's a variegated form that's available that's been introduced from Japan that's called Kiko. So you have the shredded umbrella, but then this beautiful variegated foliage as well. And this is one that you'll find more specialty online sources. It tends to be very pricey, but it's well worth including. And sedges really, for the most part, tend to be underrated. People haven't used them as much as I think they really should. And this is our native Pennsylvania sedge. And this is one, when I talked earlier about, taking clues from nature and observing and seeing what's growing in the woods and dark shade and such. A lot of times you're going to see different types of sedges growing in those situations. And the sedges are, perfect if you need, particularly areas that are tough to grow some of, our other more showier plants. It's nice to have green there. So I would highly recommend trying some of these different sedges. And here you see our native Pennsylvania sedge, and it'll form this beautiful soft ground cover underneath trees and shrubs, and it's just a perfect ground cover. It'll slowly spread and give you this kind of, almost looks like a sea of green, the way, like waves, the way it's kind of arching over itself, a kind of an undulating pattern that you see there. And here it's mixed with ferns and hostas, and I believe these are some winterberry hollies that it's growing with, and just it smothers weeds too, so it cuts down on the weeding, which is key. And they're super tough. It'll tolerate some drought, and literally, if you have it in an area where you can get in, I've seen people literally put their mower on the highest setting and go through and just mow it. But I usually just go through and just grab the clumps with my hand and just go through with shears and cut it off once in the early spring, because I usually leave it up through the winter to provide some interest in the winter as well. And is just another form of sedge. This is not a native sedge, but one that I found to be very useful in Connecticut, growing underneath those large Norway spruce trees. And this is the Carricksutter stica. And there are several forms of this. I prefer the variegata because it adds some color and brightness in the shade garden, but it tolerates drought, I found in Connecticut, and it spreads and will form a beautiful 8 to 10 inch ground cover. Again, the flowers really are pretty much nondescript, so I wouldn't necessarily grow it for the flowers, but more for a kind of weed smothering ground cover. And it's not overly aggressive either. But in those situations where you have shade and maybe the ground tends to dry out in the summertime, I would try this one. It's a perfect plant. And here you see it growing a little bit along the border of a shade garden. And again, as with the sedges, ferns too, often not used enough, in my opinion, in shade gardens. And they should be, just to add foliage interest, not only once they're fully unfurled, but when the fronds are starting to come out. I mean, here you see Christmas fern in the bottom, and look how exquisite that is and beautiful the way those are unfurling. It's just a wonderful look. I prefer Christmas fern at this time of year when those fronds are coming out. I think it's so picture perfect at this time of year. A wonderful addition. And ferns come in all sizes, from things that can get 4 to 5 feet tall, the fronds, to some really more petite ones that only get 3 or 4 inches tall. And then different colors. You have your Japanese painted ferns that you see here, contrasting with a purple Simicifuga. Just a wonderful use of colors and textures and the use of the ferns. This is I believe one called Silver Ghost, the painted fern. And here's our cinnamon fern, the native one. And here you see, this is growing under high canopy shade in the bottom left, in those beautiful fertile fronds with that nice cinnamony brown coloration that stands out like that. Beautiful, 4 feet tall, these clumps that, slowly form these colonies of these stems. I remember when I was a child, I used to, in my parents' backyard, we had a massive planting of this. And it was just a lot of fun as a kid to crawl around and play underneath them. And that's always something too, if you can add that kind of element to have, children to be able to utilize these if it's an area where they're not going to damage other plants. It's kind of fun to have that as well in the garden. And just again, showing the use of the hostas and ferns and plants in the garden. So I wanted to just real quickly, I know we're getting out of time, but I wanted to just touch on just I have like 4 plants I wanted to talk with you about that are in the trees and shrubs. I could go on, but just a couple that I found are kind of special and fun to use. And the first being the trailing arbutus, or the Apigia repens. This is a native evergreen ground cover that's more mat forming the way it grows. It's related to rhododendrons and azaleas. It's in the ericaceous family. So it's in the same family as rhododendrons and azaleas and blueberries. But it has these thick, leathery leaves that, again, are evergreen. So it's going to be maybe 2 or 3 inches growing above the ground and just slowly spreading. And kind of, this really wants well-drained but acid soils is key. Most things in that ericaceous family are acid loving. So that's key. Don't plant this if you have a really a lot of limestone in your yard. It's not going to be particularly happy. And it does want some high canopy shade and not a lot of bright direct light, particularly in the afternoon, or it will burn some. But what's lovely is right now in the mid-April, it produces these wonderful white to pink flowers. Here you see the foliage, how it overlaps and forms that wonderful evergreen ground cover. And here are the flowers that are, unfortunately, this one you do literally have to be hands and knees and leaning right over to see these flowers, but even better is to smell them. These flowers have a wonderful, just a most pleasing fragrance to them, but you have to get right down there, so get your nose in there to smell them. But it's delightful and well worth the effort. And I would say, yeah, it's not the easiest plant to find. And because it does require the acid, well-drained soils, not always, people aren't always successful growing this plant. So a lot of times you may have to try this a few times until you find the exact right spot for it. It is also the state flower of Massachusetts. Another ground cover, evergreen ground cover, is the native Wiltheria procumbens or wintergreen. You know, in all parts of this plant, if you crush the foliage, if you eat the fruits, which are edible, you're going to get a wonderful wintergreen flavor in your mouth or on your fingers. This is also in that same ericaceous family, the rhododendron family or heath family. And you see the resemblance of these flowers to they resemble blueberry flowers that you see there. A wonderful evergreen, super tough, will creep around the ground in between rocks and logs and other plants, and really it's very undemanding. It'll form just this beautiful carpet of shiny dark green foliage, and then these wonderful, some of them often the size of a dime, the size of the bright red fruits, and birds love them. And if you find them in the woods, it's a great little snack. It'll freshen up your breath a little bit. If you've got, you forgot to brush your teeth in the morning, it's a perfect thing to pick a couple and freshen up your breath. And here you see the new growth coming out. It comes out a lovely kind of a reddish orange coloration before it goes to that lustrous dark green. I love this plant. It's just a really wonderful evergreen ground cover. Here you see it growing in the wild, mixed with our native low bush blueberry. And then Coralopsis, and this is one that's flowering right now, starting to open. It's related to our witch hazels, not to be confused. This is the common name winter hazel. And the winter hazels flower in the spring, when our hybrid witch hazels that some of you may grow are starting to wrap up their flowering. The winter hazel is starting to flower with these lovely pendulous clusters of these creamy yellow flowers that have often, particularly this one, a wonderful fragrance to them. It's a large shrub, so it's going to need some space. It can get 6 to 8 feet tall and wide over time, a multi-stem shrub. But the flowers this time of year, before the leaves have come out, they're just really very, very graceful and showy. And then I'm going to wrap up with, I would say probably, I say this about a lot of the plants, but this is also a favorite for that kind of high canopy shade garden, where the trees have been limbed up. There's a lot of bright light, a lot of indirect light getting through, rays of sun coming through, and that's the Fothergillas. And Fothergilla Mount Airy is a wonderful selection. In May, it produces these beautiful bottle brush flowers that you see here that have a nice fragrance to them as well. This plant will grow 5 feet tall by 5 feet wide, multi-stem shrub. This also is related, same family as our witch hazels and our winter hazels. It's in the witch hazel family. And you notice the resemblance when you look at the foliage of the Fothergilla. Here you see a selection called Blue Shadow, which has these wonderful kind of powder blue coloration to them. Just a beautiful foliage plant. And the other reason to grow Fothergillas is because of the fall color. And they have probably one of the best shrubs in the shade garden for fall color. It gets these fiery oranges and yellows that you see here. And it's just, I love it because it gives you interest for so many of the seasons. You have the flowers before the leaves come out, and then you have a beautiful kind of blue-green foliage that you have, and then the fall color. So you have, spring, summer, and fall, there's something going on with this plant. And then, once the foliage drops, you have just the shape of the shrub, but it's a wonderful shrub that I encourage you to try. The flowers themselves, it's attractive to so many different types of pollinators. And, we're always looking for plants for fall color, particularly ones that we can recommend as an alternative to invasive plants like the burning bush that, is causing so many issues in our woodlands and our native, affecting our native plants as well. So, in Fothergilla, it's not native to our region, but it is native to more of the mid-Atlantic and southeastern parts of the United States. So I would definitely, if you can find this plant, which you should be able to in many garden centers, I would offer, encourage you to try it. With that, I know I've run over, and I could keep going on and on about plants, but I want to make sure I don't mess up too much with your agenda. So I'm going to stop sharing, and hopefully you folks have some questions, and I would be happy to provide you with any answers. And hopefully the way things are going and people are getting vaccinated and such, we can have you all come up and visit and spend some time at the gardens. I would love to see many of you, and we have a really exciting year ahead up here. We're expecting to have real good visitation with, people being vaccinated and people being able to feel more comfortable getting out in public more, and knowing that hopefully COVID is starting to be behind us, fingers crossed. But with that, I hope you have some questions, and hopefully I provided you with a few ideas of some plants that you can try in your own yards. And if you don't have questions or don't feel comfortable asking them in this forum, feel free to email me at the gardens. I'd be happy to answer questions if you want to do it that way as well.
Andy, this is Marsha McLaughlin, and I was handling the chat. I only have one question that came up on chat, so if anybody else has questions after this answer, please let Andy know. The question is, do you have any problems with insect and infestations of any type, and how do you handle them if you do?
Insect infestations on any particular plant, or?
It wasn't specific. It was very general, broad.
I try to use I don't use any pesticides or herbicides unless, at the gardens, we don't do anything like that unless it's a matter of, that visitors might be affected and injured by, brown tail moth or that type of thing. And even then, it's only if it's going to be like near some area where visitors are going to be going constantly, and they might get the hairs. But in general, with my gardening and how we treat gardening here as far as insects, is we try to do it as organically as possible with, we try to practice IPM measures, integrated pest management, and really rely on chemicals as a last resort. We'll use things like, horticultural oil if we have infestations of scale on some of our plants, or, mealybugs and things like that. We try to use, maybe some insecticidal soaps, things like that. I would try at home some, but a lot of times, if a plant is that susceptible to insect infestations, I would tend to then just not keep it if it's that prone, and just get rid of it. And a lot of times, if it's like a terrible caterpillar, like gypsy moth type of things, in some cases you may have to resort to a chemical. But the thing to remember with, when you're treating for like gypsy moth or brown tail moth with a chemical, most of those are not selective just to a particular caterpillar. So if you spray an oak tree for gypsy moths, you are going to pretty much wipe out anything that's living on that oak tree, any caterpillar, good or bad. And you're going to be eliminating beneficial caterpillars that birds rely on to feed their babies, and butterfly caterpillars and really beautiful moth caterpillars that will also be injured or killed by the insecticides we use. So it's a tough one. to try to be, organic and try to, help the environment by not, applying so many of these kind of toxic materials into the environment. It's a challenge for sure. And I tend to be just really tough, and a lot of times I've thrown out plants that I absolutely adore, but they're just prone to, for some reason, aphids get on them all the time. And, like a organic material just won't cut it. And, we've mixed up concoctions of different types of oils, peppermint oils and things like that, even to try to deter voles and deer. Because we've had a major issue with underground varmints. Moles and voles have been really bad these past few years for us. And, we just being a public establishment, we have to be really careful with what we use.
Okay.
And
Okay, there,
if there was a specific plant that somebody was asking about, like how to handle, something on, like borers on something or scale on magnolias, I might be able to address that with a specific technique.
well, I think that particular person might want to contact you off
Sure.
outside of the club
Yeah.
and maybe get some help on that. Another question, is Pennsylvania sedge a spreader?
Yes. Oh yeah, it'll form a beautiful ground cover. And like I said, the only maintenance I ever do with it is usually, you can do it in the fall, but I usually wait till late winter, early spring when the snow's gone, and then I just get in there and shear it, to about 2 inches or so, and then it just puts out this wonderful grassy area. Some people even use it where they want to have no lawn. They'll just have a whole expanse of Pennsylvania sedge, and it will really serve the purpose. And you'll see it throughout the woods here. It tolerates a fair amount of shade and pretty dark shade at times. So, but
Okay.
it'll form a great ground cover. Yeah.
Super. One more question. How do we
Sure.
know if a plant is poisonous to pets? Look it up.
We Google. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's what I always do, because there's some, I refer to, I usually check first with like the state extension services if there's any question, and I don't rely on nursery tags all the time,
Right.
because there's a lot of times I find misinformation on nursery tags, and coming from the nursery industry, that was a big pet peeve of mine, that, we tried to be really careful. And if there were particular plants we knew were poisonous, like, hollies and things, we would put that on the tag. So, because there's some pets and dogs that just want to get out there and try things. And like my dog, he's out there always chewing on grass and stuff. And, it doesn't take many holly berries before that, that the poor pet would be, very sick. But I would say first, obviously there's so many sources online now these days that I do that, but I usually just go right to, like, you could go to the New Hampshire Extension Service with the university, and they may even put out a publication that you could get that lists, or even online, they have a list of poisonous plants, to pets and humans for that matter.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah,
Nancy,
sure.
I'm going to turn, yes.
I have one question. It's Martha.
Yep.
Hi, Martha.
Andy, hi, Andy. I fell in love with heuchera plants. And I know you used a lot of them at coastal Maine, but I was surprised you didn't mention them. Is it because they're so common?
No, I love them. And it's, what I love about them is, and that's an area, it's kind of like the Bruneras and stuff. There are so many now, so many heucheras. And to be honest, I couldn't pick which ones I wanted to show you guys. And I have another like 15 shrubs I was going to go through with you guys. And I get so wrapped up with the perennials, because that's really where my love is. And I feel that's where I can share you guys that passion with. And heucheras are right up there. I agree with you, Martha. They're beautiful, and they're perfect because you can get everything now from orangey yellow ones to silver ones to purple ones, and they're fantastic. No, and I love to use them both, just a single plant here or there, but also I think they're really effective used in mass and like groupings of them. And yeah, we keep adding new ones here. One thing we do have occasionally we found issues with are both voles that like to tunnel around the bases of them and chew all the roots off, which is a problem, obviously. But also there's an insect called black vine weevil, which if you grow rhododendrons, they cause the notching in your foliage. But then the larvae of the black vine weevils also eat the roots of heucheras. So a lot of times after a winter, if you go and you look at the heuchera clump that's left, and you're going to like clean it up for the spring, a lot of times it's really loose and wiggly in the soil, and that's because either the weevils larvae have eaten the roots or the voles have, and it's kind of a problem. What we've done with that, and you can try it, is sometimes if you have that crown, if you're careful and you pot that up and cover it with like a plastic bag, you can almost get it. It's like rooting that plant again, and like you're rooting a cutting. And if you're lucky, you can get that crown to root again and reestablish it. But no, I love heucheras, and it didn't make the cut with this talk, but that's all. Yeah, they're perfect. I really enjoy them.
Nancy?
Yes.
First, I just would like to say to Andy, I really thoroughly enjoyed your presentation. My yard is basically shade. I have more moss than grass, but I would say after your presentation, it's probably goes from filtered to dappled. And I've only been in the house for 3 years. I lived in Massachusetts for 42 and had a wonderful, beautiful shade garden, from Garden in the Woods, a lot of the plants. And
Nice.
The people who bought the house didn't like non-flowering plants. So I dug about 25, 30 plants as much as I could and brought them north. So they've only been planted, transplanted for 3 years, and they're not doing as well as I would have hoped, but I try to mulch my leaves and use that, kind of like you talked about, going from the more manicured part of your yard to the woods area. And I did that at my other house. And I have this huge, huge granite outcropping that I share with a neighbor, and it grows lots of different kind of moss, but it does have some crevices. It has some wild cherry growing out of it. What could I do with this rock? I mean, it's huge escarpment, to make it more interesting. Is there anything that, like bunchberry, something that would grow if I put soil in the crevices, or is it just, moss is going to be?
Yeah, I mean, the crevices are a tough little area, because one, you need to be really careful when whatever you plant in there, you just have to, the key thing is being very diligent of like caring for it and watering them initially until they really get established in that, because it's a small amount of soil. But
Okay.
things I have seen, bunchberries, and even like the Pennsylvania sedge, and the trailing arbutus I talked about. I've seen that up on rock outcroppings growing in, very little soil. So those are some things you could try. You just have to be really careful, what you put in there, and, just make sure that, how is the crevice very deep, so with the soil you put in, I would keep putting it in and watering it, so it all settles down to the bottom. So you're planting in something pretty solid, so you don't plant and then water, and then the whole thing sinks in even more.
Okay.
And I feel for you, because I've been moving plants too from my house that I owned in Connecticut 3 years ago. And I sold my house to my kids just so I had a way to get all those plants back to Maine. Because I have like hundreds and hundreds of woodland plants that I'm still trying to move up here, and I'm dealing with the moss that you've mentioned. And the one thing with that, if you're having trouble growing some things and getting them established, I would try to have a soil test done of the soil in the area, and send that to the extension service. A lot of times they'll do the soil test for free, or for a small fee of like $15 or $20. And tell them the types of plants you're going to be growing in that area, and they'll do a pH, and they'll make recommendations as far as, what you need to put down as far as compost or some sort of organic fertilizer to improve the soil so you can grow, your shade plants that you want to grow there.
Do you fertilize your shade plants? I mean, what do you use?
I don't. I usually just
Okay.
take compost, like you've been using the ground up leaves that are aged, and I'll take some of my scraps from inside the house,
Mhm.
vegetables, and let that compost, and that's what I put around them. For the most
Okay.
part, I think people tend to over fertilize their plants,
Right.
and they
I
just get
have,
so
I
much.
never did.
They get
Yeah, I
so much.
never did.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
get so much leafy growth, and a lot of times if you over fertilize and too much nitrogen on the plants, you sometimes jeopardize flowering because the plants
Okay.
are so pumped up and they want to keep growing foliage. So I usually just use an aged compost material, or if anything, an organic, very low nitrogen fertilizer. Very
Okay.
low nitrogen.
My yard backs up to 30 acres of conservation land, but when I walk it, there doesn't seem to be, much understory, not like my woods at home, and I don't understand what it is. So I'm going to try to add, I do have 1 or 2 low bush blueberries in my yard. I'm going to try to do more of that, but it's kind of interesting
Yeah.
that,
Yes. That could be many, it could be, the amount of shade, but it also could be due to our four-legged friends
yeah, we do have here. I
that,
know
and they have good choices in the plants they like too, like us, they like our woodland plants as much as we do. They just like to eat them.
Okay. And one more thing, I don't want to take up the club's time. Could you just put your email address in the chat?
Yes.
Put your reference, and I'll copy that down. And I would say, once again, it was an awesome presentation and I really enjoyed it. Thank you so much.
Oh, you're welcome.
It was awesome too. All I can say is the plants in your presentation, they looked lush, healthy, vibrant, and interesting, and you did a wonderful job, Andy.
Oh, thank you.
I did want to see if anybody else had any questions at all.
I have one.
Okay, go right ahead.
Andy, what is the best time of year to visit the garden? Or is there a best time?
Yeah, I know. Thanks for. I would say.
I'm sorry.
No. I would say usually I would come in. Well, it depends what you're looking for. So by the middle of June, we've got lots of our perennials and shrubs are in flower, but also all of the annuals and things have been planted. So I would say mid to the 3rd week in June would be a great time to come visit. A lot of the plants I showed today, though, would be looking their best in May, first couple of weeks of May. And we opened this year, May 1st. And, if you're interested in those woodland plants, then I would say come in May to look at those. It would be perfect.
Very good.
Or get a membership and then come back many times.
Okay. There you go.
There's a little plug. I get paid to put that in now.
Yeah, okay. I do have one other question, a big favor. Martha, you advised me about putting on the record. Well, I recorded a little bit too late, or I didn't push the button hard enough because I caught Andy just as it was starting. So I wanted to know if it would be possible for you to just repeat a little bit of the bio so that it will be able to be picked up online.
Okay, do you want me to do that later or do you want me to do it now?
No, do it now, and we'll just add it to the end, as people, so that they can hear about Andy as well, okay?
Okay,
And
so
Andy, if you could just bear with us for a few minutes.
Sure.
Thank you.
Okay, so you want me to do it right now?
Yes,
right?
if you can, yes.
Okay. For 27 years, Andy Brand was employed at Broken Arrow Nursery in Hamden, Connecticut, where he was the nursery manager. In March 2018, Andy joined the staff of the Coastal Maine Botanical Garden as curator of living collections and is now also the interim director of horticulture. His responsibilities include plant selection and introducing new plants to the garden's collection and maintaining plant records and labels. He is past president of the Connecticut Nursery and Landscape Association and is an avid naturalist. He is a co-founder and past president of the Connecticut Butterfly Association. He has put his interest in native plants to use as a volunteer for the New England Plant Conservation Program, where he has helped monitor historical sites of endangered native plants. He has spoken to groups on a range of topics, including native plants, new and unusual ornamentals, butterfly gardening, and Maine butterflies and their life histories. Andy, along with his wife, Michelle, lives in Bristol, Maine. And it is with great honor that I welcome Andy to our program.
Thank you very much, Martha. Thank you so much, Andy. And ladies, oh, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just thanking you. Yes.
Oh, okay. And ladies, let's give him a great, unmute yourselves and let's give him a great big hand of applause.
Thank you so much. It was fun. And like I said,
Okay.
it's a great distraction for me to get away from all the other stuff going on right now. So it's great to talk about plants. And yeah, you see my email, I just put it on the chat. So, you know, if you have any questions, feel free to shoot me an email. And I am probably going to leave the meeting if that's all right with you folks.
That's fine.
And then we will, you know, hopefully I'll see several of you up at the gardens.
Yes, I'm
Nancy?
sure that you will.
If you
Thank
do.
you so much.
Yep.
Yes,
Could I ask Andy one more question?
go
Sure.
ahead, Nancy.
In a couple weeks, isn't Maine Botanical Garden sponsoring painters to come and do plein air painting?
There may be something through the education. Yeah, that would be through the education department. Like, I know there's a big like botanical illustration classes going on. So maybe the painting might be part of it. Yeah.
I think so.
I'm
Thank
not-
you.
Unfortunately, I'm not positive of that though. Yeah. Are you coming up to do some painting?
No, but I saw an advertisement about that, so that's why I
Yeah.
mentioned.
Yeah. And
Okay, very good.
we do, and there's a photography club that comes every Thursday and they get to come in early before we open and take photographs of all the gardens and flowers and things. So it's,
Okay.
but hopefully, yeah. And if you guys come up even individually, just, you know, don't hesitate to give a holler out and say, hey, you go up to my group and just to say hello. I can reach you, right? Be
Awesome.
happy to say hi. So,
Thank you.
Thank
All
you
right.
so very much.
Oh, you're
We're gonna
welcome. Good to
stop
see
our
everybody.
recording now.
enjoy the rest of your meeting.
All right, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
All righty.
Nancy?